A lonely man in the Yukon wilderness led a little freezing bobcat into his cabin. The air was sharp with cold. The kinthat made his lungs ache with each breath. It was early morning, sky just starting to hint at light behind a thicker taint of clouds. Robert, a retired history teacher in his 70s, sat in his armchair with a wool blanket over his knees and a book resting on his chest. He had lived alone for the past 15-year scene, a log cabin he'd built himself, nestled between towering spruces and Urling. Ridge 3 hours from any real town, solitude wasn't just his preference. It was his salvation. He had been about to doze off again when he heard it, a sound faint and urgent, unlike the wind moaning through the trees. He opened one eye, then slowly rose and shuffled toward the door, the cold sneaking in through every crack. He opened it cautiously, squinting against pale light and biting wind. There, shivering on the porch, was a bobcat cub, barely the size of a house cat, its fur stiff with frost, and its ears flattened against its tiny head. It made no sound now, just sat there trembling. Robert stared, heart knocking against his ribs. He knew better than to interfere with wildlife, but this cub looked nearly frozen, alone, and on the edge of collapse. He stood for a moment, torn. Then, the cub wobbled and nearly tipped over, and instinct overtook logic. He opened the door wider and stepped aside. The little creature hesitated, then stumbled forward on new MBS as it crossed the threshold. Robert noticed movement in the snow just beyond the porch. A second cub. This one was barely crawling, dragging itself slowly through the powder, like every step cost more than it had. Robert cursed softly under his breath, grabbed his coat and gloves, and moved toward the second cub. It collapsed right before. He reached it. With delicate hands, he lifted it into his arms, surprised by how light it felt, how fragile. He turned back into the warmth of the cabin, shutting the door firmly behind him. He brought both cubs into the back room where an old wood stove crackled. He layered towels on the floor, wrapped them, and began gently rubbing warmth back into their limbs. One whimpered, the other remained still, but its chest rose and fell. He stayed with them, whispering gently, monitoring their breathing, putting out small bowls of water. The room grew warmer by the hour, and Robert barely moved from their side. He switched. Out the towels when they became damp with melting snow and body heat. Refilled the water when tiny tongues flicked at the edges. He moved lowly, gently, as if any loud motion might scare the breath out of them. Their eyes were still fogged with exhaustion, but one of them, the smaller of the two, began to nudge closer to Thefire. It didn't seem afraid of him anymore. When Robert moved, hishened close. It leaned its tiny head into his palm for a second before collapsing again in sleep. It wasn't until midday that he allowed himself to relax. The cubs were alive. One had started to stir, crawling weakly toward the warmth of the fire. The other blinked slowly, eyes glassy but aware. Robert watched them from a few feet away, sipping hot tea. He wondered where their mother was. He also wondered if he'd just made a mistake that would invite nature's wrath straight through his walls. He didn't have to wonder long. That night, just after the last light bled from the sky, something scraped lightly against the back door. Robert froze. The sound came again, low, measured, not frantic. He stood and made his way to the kitchen window. What he saw made his blood chill deeper than the weather ever could. A full-grown bobcat stood outside, her coat dusted with snow, her frame gauntned, trembling. Her eyes caught the moonlight and shone gold. She looked directly at the cabin, ears alert, bodily and tense. Robert didn't move. Slowly he cracked open the back door. The wind whistled through. The bobcat didn't growl or advance. She stood perfectly still as if waiting. He backed away, leaving the door slightly ajar. From the side room, Thecubs gave a few soft cries. Within seconds, the mother moved. Graceful, silent. She padded through. The door entered into the room where her young were. Robert watched from the hall, ass curled around them, nuzzling and licking their heads. They responded timidly, crawling into her warmth. He felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with something far more fragile, a kind of awe. She hadn't attacked, she hadn't fled. She had trusted him just enough to follow the scent of her cubs into a human space. He wondered what desperation must have driven her to allow that. He closed the door gently, not wanting to intrude. The next morning, Robert placed a few strips of leftover caribou on a ceramic plate just outside the bedroom door. Hadn't know if she would eat it. But hen hunting would be difficult with this, no waist deep encrusted with ice. Hours later, when he returned, the plate was empty. The water bowl, too. The storm worsened that afternoon. Wind howled through the trees like a warning, and snow lashed the windows with unrelenting force. Robert stayed inside, tending the fire, drinking tea, and listening to the occasional rustle or chirp from the side room. Once he heard a soft growl, not angry but protective. It made him smile. For 3 days he lived in that rhythm, his quiet footsteps, replenished. Food and water, and a careful balance of presence and absence. By the second night something subtle had shifted, and Robert came to place food near the threshold. The mother bobcat no longer moved away. She watched, her golden eyes steady, her body relaxed, but still alert. When Hugh whispered, she flicked an ear. When Helen lingered a moment longer, she didn't bare her teeth. There was understanding in her gaze, not trust perhaps, but a truce. He wondered what the cubs thought of him, whether they remembered Hishon's warming, their frozen limbs, whether the memory lived in them, wild and small as they were. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, burying Theppert's steps completely. The world outside vanished into a white blur.
Ice.
But inside, there was warmth, life, and an unexpected sense of connection.
Out.
Robert found himself listening for their breathing at night, the soft scratching off claws against wood, the faint sound of purring, as purring from one of Thecub's as it nestled closer to its mother. He didn't sleep much. No? Not because he was worried, but because he didn't want Thomas anything. On the 4th morning, the sky opened in a blinding blue. Insolence blanketed the wilderness. The storm had passed. The wind was gone. In its place was stillness, so pure it felt like the world had paused to breathe. Light spilled through windows, bright and clean, illuminating very dust mote in the air like suspended stars. Robert stood in front of the cabin's main door and looked out. Snow shimmered under the sun, and everything felt strangely holy. When Robert opened the door that day, the room was empty. No trace, just some shed fur and paw prints in the snow leading back into the woods. He stood in the doorway for a long while, his breath curling and theckled, wondering if any of it had really happened. He knelt slowly, fingertips grazing the faint outline of a paw print pressed into the melted crust of snow just beyond the threshold. It hadn't been a dream. The fur tangled into the blanket was real. The bowls still licked clean. Something sacred had passed it through his life and vanished before it could be fully held. That day he didn't light the fire. He sat in stead insolence, gazing at the door as though expecting them to come back. But Thebopeks were wild. It returned toward their world, and he remained in his 2 separate spheres that had, for a moment, touched like threads in wind. A spring, slow and careful. Buds pushed from branches, and the river cracked its icicrest. The air softened, smelling faintly of wet pine and thawed soil. Robert began hiking again, his camera slung over one shoulder. He hadn't felt like photographing in years, but something had shifted. The lens became less of a tool and more of an excuse to look closely, to stay alert, to be present. He started looking for signs off the bobcats, scanning the trees' undridged lines. Sometimes he found prints, just barely visible depressions in the softening mud, or faint claw marks etched into old bark. Once a tuft of golden fur snagged on a bush near the bend of the stream. Another time droppings near a dawn he hadn't noticed before, but never the cats themselves. They remained elusive, like Memoroshoff remembered, but deeply felt. Still, Robert felt them watching. When he sat in a fallen log to drink from his canteen, the hairs on his neck would lift. When he snapped a photo of a quiet glen, he sometimes sensed he was by and studied from the brush. He spoke aloud during those hikes now, quietly and without expectation. he'd say. Lie. Thanks for the visit, or just missed you. Then one afternoon in early July, Robert wandered deeper than usual, following the rise of a narrow ridge. The day was unusually still. No birdsong, no rustle, just the crunch of his boots and the click of his camera strap. He reached a jagged slope, dusted with gravel and loose stone. As he began his descent, his boot caught on a slick patch, and he stumbled, arms flailing. He slid, striking rock and ice and earth, landing hard against a cold outcrop. Pain shot through his leg like fire. A groan escaped his lips loud, and tried to stand, but his ankle gave under him with a sickening crack. Maybe a break. It's definitely not just a sprain. The pain was sharp and merciless. Crawled to the nearest tree, dragging his injured leg behind him. Every breath burned. He propped himself up and pulled his coat tight, eyes scanning the horizon. No phone. No signal, and no one knew where he was. His heart sank, slowly into his gut. The temperature fell as sun began its quiet descent behind the ridgeline. Shadows spilled acroseth, snow like spilled ink, cold and creeping. Robert forced himself to stay awake. He slapped his cheeks, rubbed his arms, fought the pull of sleep, that came to easily with shock. Then, just as Hebegon, drifting from pain and cold, a roosling came from the brush, sharp, deliberate, not wind, not a squirrel. His heart jumped. He turned his head weakly. It was her, the mother bobcat. She stood a few feet away, silent as snowfall, her fur glinting faintly in the dying light. Behind her, two younger bobcats waited, lean and watchful. Not quite cubs anymore, not quite adults. She stepped forward slow and measured, sniffing the air. Her gaze fixed on him. Then she turned and began walking away, but paused to look back at him. Robert didn't move. He couldn't, but his lips parted slightly, his breath catching. She returned, circled him once like a cat circling prey. But there was no injury in her body language, only purpose. Then she trotted off again, this time faster, intentional. He wasn't sure how long he sat there after Shetty sappered. The minutes blurred, fillingly with the ache in his leg and the distant echo of paws in the snow. He closed his eyes once, maybe twice, struggling to stay conscious. Then, a sound low at first, mechanical, faint. Within 2 hours, the sound of distant tangents broke the silence. Then closer voices, footsteps crunching snow, shouted names, crackling radios. Then shapes appeared through the trees. To rescue workers in bright orange gear, moving fast, eyes scanning. Robert Myers. We got a call from the Ranger station. Some hikers spotted animal tracks circling this area strangely. Anthy thought something was wrong. One knelt beside him, checking his pulse, wrapping a thermal blanket around his holders. Robert couldn't find the words. He was too tired to speak. Booth's eyes drifted toward the ridge where Bobcat had stood, where she had waited, where she had turned back on Seto, make sure he saw nothing. She was gone. Back at the cabin, leg wrapped in crutches, leaning beside his chair, Robert thought often of that moment. Had never told anyone the full truth. Ickers had seen tracks, yes. But their skew team only found him because Pawthos' tracks had led directly to him and looped again and again, like a beacon. And he knew it wasn't coincidence. Those weren't aimless. Animal prints, they were deliberate, circular, persistent. It was as though she'd drawn a map in the snow, circling his fallen body. Like punctuation on a sentence, she had waited months to write, and somehow Simeon had read it. Each night afterward, as the pain in his leg dulled in, the bruises bloomed yellow and green before fading. He would close his eye sand, see her face again. Sharp, intelligent, ancient, the face of something wild and dignified that had weighed him. Measured him, and just unsolicited, he was worth saving. August came bright and rich. The forest buzzed with life. Birds nested, elk returned to the meadows. Warm winds blew through the trees, and the scent of pine mingled with wild flowers and damp earth. Robert moved more easily now, still slow, but no longer wincing with every step. He spent his mornings walking the trails closest to home, not far, just far enough to smell the world changing around him. He sat often on his perch with a notebook balanced on one eye, sketching the shape of the mother bobcat from memory. Every line in her fees, every ripple of her muscles. Hugh an artist by any stretch, but then need to remember her truthfully felt an act of gratitude. Sometimes hecked up himself smiling without meaning, lost in the image of her staring through the kitchen window that first night, torn between instinct and hope. There were other signs, too. Once a Hefferton hare, near the steps, neatly killed, not torn. Another time, his woodpile had been disrupted. Paw prints leading in and out. She never stayed, but she had come close again, and that was enough. They were reminders he liked. To think small messages. We're still here, we remember. One evening, just before dusk, Stesky turned the color of old gold and shadows bled from the trees like ink, looked up from his notebook and froze, across the clearing just beyond their atch. Of the trees, she stood once more, healthy, strong, and poised. Her first shimmered in the last light of day. Shoo us in alone. Her two young, now nearly grown, flanked her, taller than before, more filled out, but still unmistakable. One had a faint mark above the left eye, the same cub that had first leaned into his palm by the fire. The other crouched low, ears twitching. Alert, she stared at Robert, not with fear, not with aggression, with knowing. He rose lowly, pressing one hand to the porch rail. He didn't raise his voice, didn't move any closer, just stood in her presence, letting silence speak. In that moment, everything else fell away. The years, the loneliness, the dull ache, fudge. All that remained was this. One man, three wild creatures, and a memory made real again. No movement, no sound. Then a flick of her tail, a signal. Shuddered and vanished into the trees, her children behind her, graceful and silent as ever. Robert stood long after they'd gone, his hands still resting on thwu wood. The sky faded from gold to slate, the first stars blinking alive above the treetops. But he didn't go inside. He went ready to close the door on thieving. He felt something shift again in his chest. It's not pain, not grief. Something freer, something like belonging. Had saved her children, she had saved him. And the forest, Thule, had borne witness to it,